Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a former colleague of mine, Dr. Joshua Farris. Dr. Farris, how you doing?
Hey, good to be with you. Good to see you again. It's been a while.
Long time no talk.
Uh-huh.
Um, well, you've got a new book. I think it just came out.
Yes.
You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, great. It's called The Creation of Self, and you can get it on any major platform, including Amazon and the like. There's an ebook, and um, hopefully we'll have an audiobook down the road,
Oh,
several
nice.
months down the road, maybe next year. I don't know.
Are you gonna like do its own voice, do your own reading?
I don't know. I think they have a process. I'm not sure. I have to look into the process again
Yeah,
to
yeah,
see
okay.
what the
Okay.
process is. I've not done it before, but anyway, that is the plan. But yeah, yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about the creation of self.
Good.
It's basically a defense of the soul, a kind of an older view of persons or selves, as selves are. There's quite a lot of discussion right now about selves, not just from philosophers, although philosophers have been thinking about it a lot recently, and there's been a lot of views, particularly versions of materialism, emergentism, and panpsychism that have been offered in the academic analytic discussions, neuroscience discussions, and the like. But there's also been lots of growing discussions around the self from psychologists, social scientists, as well as biologists and the like. There's been several recent publications, so this is coming at I think, at a good time. The creation of self is a defense of the soul, an older view of persons that has become it's, at least in social perceptions, or at least amongst many academics, it's deemed as being somewhat outmoded or out of fashion and no longer sort of a viable view, depending on a variety of different perspectives or philosophical assumptions about the nature of science and what science actually tells us today. And so it is, but it's not only a defense of the soul, it's a defense of a particular kind of soul, a soul that is an older view that really would kind of fit in line with um, kind of the old Platonists, the old Augustinians, and even the old Cartesians. Um, but more than that, it's also a defense of a creationist view of the soul, hence the name, the creation of self. And so the view I take is that the self is a soul or an immaterial substance. The self is a distinct type of property bear from the physical body and the properties that it has or that it instantiates. It's a distinct type of property bear, and certain characteristic properties are deserving of our reflection in order to get a sense of the soul, particularly phenomenal qualities of what it's like, or the experiential likeness of something, the experience, the felt quality, in other words, the felt quality of experiencing something new as a conscious individual. And these kinds of characteristic properties tell us a little bit about the soul, it seems to me. Particularly the first person perspective becomes rather important to who it is that we are and how it is that we are what we are, and how it is that we know we are what we are. The self concept, the first person perspective, informs that in some way and informs who it is that we are. And it seems to me that that's a basic sort of idea that we have about ourselves when we're interacting with others, that we naturally take for granted in our interactions with others as being part and parcel of or evidence for who we are. But even more so, the book is a defense of a creationist view, the idea that God, or something like God, some sort of being, a supernatural being, an agent of a sort, an agent may be that we are even like, a person-like being, has who has first-person consciousness, the ability to discriminate between options, namely of the kind of world that we live in, discriminate between options between different selves existing at different times with different bodies. It is that kind of being that brings about the existence of the soul. And there's something unique about the origination of that soul or your soul that makes it determinate that some sort of agential explanation, or as somebody like Richard Swinburne would call it, a personal explanation, is necessary or sufficient to explain why it is that this soul comes into to being rather than another soul. And so it is also an argument for what's called theistic dualism, which is a common term used in the literature, the wider academic analytic literature, to refer to the close or intimate relationship between this type of entity, or that this type of property bearers being distinct from physical bodies, and the kind of thing that it is that requires not only a unique description, but also a unique explanation for its coming into existence. And so it seems to me that there's a lot about the nature of the soul that points us back to something like God or God himself, that is the causal explanation for the existence of the soul. And so I mean, this is kind of motivated in some ways, certainly by the older discussions on the origins of the soul, which has come out of fashion, but it's coming back into fashion with recent discussions about the nature of emergentism that I think overlap with the discussions about human origins and biological discussions and these sorts of things. But also it overlaps with other discussions as well about the creation of the world. And I lost my train of thought for a moment. But anyway, the consciousness arguments for God that have become more of interest of late to analytic philosophers. And there's been a growing body of literature developing the consciousness arguments for God. Right. So it's motivated by a couple different sets of literature, certainly some that's more theologically oriented, and then others that's more in the realm of natural theology or even philosophy of mind, but the implications of the philosophy of mind back to theism. And so
like here for those listening, like Richard Swinburne, J.P. Moreland, right? That's what you kind of have in mind. These sorts of arguments, Brendan Rickabaugh, that these types of arguments that are being made by these philosophers, right?
That's right. Yeah, there's some of the key ones that I have in mind that have obviously influenced me.
Yeah.
J.P.'s Consciousness Argument for God. What is it called? Consciousness and the Existence of God. His old book in 2008, Routledge book, which I thought was a great book, underappreciated for what it was, and it was a good book, good argument. I thought it was fascinating. But anyway, yeah, that's what I have in mind. But also the older discussions, theological discussions that are starting to make their way back into the recent kind of developing or interest of science and religion scholars or science and theology scholars who are taking more seriously not only the nature of consciousness, but the conscious property bearers and the kinds of beings they are in relationship to human origins, the human origins discussion, which is a vast discussion on a wide variety of issues. And so there is some kind of situating of my argument in some of the broader science and religion discussions in a way to make an argument that it's an objection against certain views, particularly materialism, but also what I develop in the book is related views, which you even might call pseudo-naturalistic views. At least there's some overlap in how they're conceiving of the universe, the explanations of the universe as lawful, as bringing about or explaining the origination of different types or hierarchical types of organisms. And so it's really partly an objection against materialism, emergentism, and even panpsychist views, and then a defense as a result, showing that there is a soul that is necessary to make sense of these properties, even a particular kind of soul, and that the explanation for that particular kind of soul seems to point us back to the causal explanation of a personal agent, a personal being. And so that's the big idea.
So I know in your book you have arguments against materialism and at least certain versions of emergentism and panpsychism. Let's talk about these for a minute. In particular, by any chance, do you engage eliminativism at all?
Yeah, a little bit.
Can you tell us a little bit what you have to say to that? Because what if someone's just kind of like really skeptical, right? Let's put our real skeptical hats on, and they just deny what I think is the obvious, and that they deny that there really is a self as we, according to our common folk psychology, as one would like to say. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I'm trying to think, do I directly deal with eliminative materialism? It's certainly there. It's certainly referenced. I referenced some of the literature, certainly about eliminativism and illusionism by Keith Frankish and other people. But do I respond to that directly? Yeah, I mean, I do gesture at responses. I don't know if I give a full-on response to eliminativism, because
maybe you can
level,
give us like a little bit of a gesture,
yeah,
and then maybe just talk about kind of how the old reductive views have seen better days in the literature. Maybe kind of talk about that, and then we can move on to emergentism and panpsychism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, materialism is kind of the view that we are physical through and through. We are material objects. Organisms is understood through a particular common understanding of naturalism, and so there are different versions of materialism. Or materialism is often referred as a global expression to the kind of the bigger picture, the cosmos, and physicalism is now more often used in reference to kind of local objects or particular entities and things. And so obviously reductive physicalism had quite a bit of popularity in the early 1900s, and it's kind of gone out of popularity. But there's also been a more strident, even more stubborn kind of physicalism that you're referring to, which is a kind of eliminativism, which I mean, actually, to be honest, if eliminativist, I think they're at least more consistent. I mean, in some of the arguments that I make in terms of qualia and things in the book, and in pain and how we understand that, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, this is why there's even a strong growing trend away from reductive physicalist amongst physicalist defenders who are wanting to continue in their sort of physicalist with their physicalist commitments about persons. There's a strong tendency away from even reductive physicalism as providing any sort of sufficient reduction of qualitative properties, consciousness properties, to their underlying physical parts, or physical the physical composition of the organism, the biological organism. But eliminativism is a more radical position. I mean, the book I gesture toward the idea that reductionistic views and identity views actually end up they fall into eliminativism. They end up
kind of reductio,
a kind of eliminativism. Yeah. So there is a kind of reductio argument there. They do seem to end up in that camp. And if I mean, with the eliminativist, it seems to me that, well, they're being more honest with their own view. At least they can give a more coherent explanation or defense of their own view if they take that line, because, well, they just get rid of qualia. So they get rid of the heart problem altogether. There is no heart problem because, well, qualitative properties don't exist at all. So why do they need to explain it if it doesn't exist? And I mean, at one level, I don't take that seriously.
Right.
And I don't think they do when they wake up in the morning. And
Well,
they,
as a Reedian, as you know, I'm a Reedian, and that just that goes against my basic common sense principles.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So why, I guess I guess they would have to get rid of their own common sense. Common sense wouldn't be the proper way of knowing the world for them, right? I mean, they would have to give that up, wouldn't they?
Yeah. At least part of it, and then the whole consistency thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
Reed's same shop argument.
Mhm.
So kind of
Right.
contrasting a hard reductionism, we can talk about emergent dualism, which says, as I understand it, that certain mental states, mental properties, or on some harder versions like Haskell, even a soul, emerges from complex neurophysiological properties, like a magnetic force field emerges from a magnet. Why not go with that view? Tell us maybe some worries that you have about this view.
Yeah, it's a big question. So there is, I mean, in many ways, I would say that the emergent dualist view is kind of the more, uh, on the other end, kind of the more radical view of a kind of a kind of certainly a kind of naturalistic agency. I mean, so these guys who are defending this, like Hasker, would still affirm some kind of naturalistic frame, some kind of natural world that has its own sort of built-in explanations that give rise to higher level or higher order organisms through some sort of understanding of physical laws or natural laws. There's still some interesting overlap between them, between emergent dualists and other physicalists. They're coming from a similar vantage point. I mean, this obviously gets complicated when we start talking about panpsychism, but even panpsychism of many varieties is still sort of operating out of this sort of natural frame or this naturalistic understanding of the universe that doesn't have this sort of outside agency as part and parcel of the explanatory process for how it is that higher level organisms come about from lower level organisms and the like, or lower level physical parts, etc. Emergent dualism is more radical in that way, in that it really does take seriously the nature of consciousness. And I mean, somebody like Hasker would take seriously phenomenal consciousness in particular and phenomenality, and he takes those properties really seriously. And he would move even beyond the sort of just step back a little bit. There's different types of dualism out there. There's predicate dualism or linguistic dualism that says, well, we need different types of explanations to make sense of the natural world and physical things in the world. And so that's kind of easier to deal with as a physicalist. If you have predicate dualism, you have just different types of explanation, different layers of explanation that are needed to make sense of different types of things. Like, say, when we're talking about water or H2O, there's different descriptions you can apply to both of those things, even if there is an identity relationship between H2O and water, right? And then there's a more radical version of property dualism, right, which says, well, there are different types of properties that are actually irreducible to the underlying properties that they may even come from or emerge from as a result of higher level complex arrangements that are not reducible either to the atomistic parts or even reducible to the holistic arrangement of the parts together interacting together. And so you have property dualism. And so Hasker's emergent dualism kind of comes out of that and says something even more radical, that we have not only these unique kind of irreducible properties that seem somewhat mysterious for many, these consciousness phenomenal properties that are real, that we should take seriously. They give us a lot of knowledge about the world that we wouldn't otherwise have just from physics or biology. He takes that seriously, but he says property dualism doesn't go far enough, right? We need an actual substance to make sense of these properties that actually bear these properties. And so in one sense, his view is more radical. In another sense, as a dualist, it's more satisfying, because it's like, well, at least you take seriously that there is mental substance, and that's good, and that There are these properties that need a distinct, unique type of substance, which is something that is commonly pushed by the dualists in the dualist literature. We need a distinct type of substance, not just a distinct type of property that makes sense of those properties. And so he takes that seriously. But it's more radical in that he's still operating out of that base and trying to make sense of the origination of this new entity, this sui generis entity, from the underlying base that property dualists too are working with. So it seems even, for some, they would say it's even more radical and even more problematic that he's even taking a further step in trying to get a new substance out of an underlying substance that it is not, arguably. Now he's in recent literature, he doesn't develop this in his book, The Emergent Self, altogether very much. He does spend a lot of time providing motivating reasons for his emergentism. Particularly, he gives two reasons that he's really spent a lot of time on. One is that it gives a more economical story for how it is that higher level organisms, like human organisms, as animals, if we think they're animals, come from lower level animals, animalist organisms.
Right.
So it gives a more tight story that fits with the sort of broader sort of evolutionary perspective that many today find quite compelling and persuasive. But also it gives, he argues, a better and more compelling account of the tight, integrated, and intimate functional relationship between the soul and the brain and central nervous system that seems to be indicated by certain literature that we have in biology and neuroscience, right? So he takes that very seriously, and he says, well, his story, whilst also taking seriously the fact of phenomenal consciousness as needing a distinct type of substance, which he motivates different types of arguments from reason. Particularly, he's big on the unity of consciousness argument, which he takes to be a kind of death blow to almost all versions of materialism. He takes that very seriously in his book. But then he gets to this origins question that he spends very little time on, and that is where he talks about, well, so we have this physical problem, we need this different type of substance to make sense of these things. It seems to come in this orderly sort of biologically evolutionary process that functions according to these basic laws and the like, that give rise to these higher order complex organisms that then give that logically bring about a sui generis type of substance. But then he raises a question, well, what is the underlying stuff that would make sense of that? I mean, can we just have sort of this brute emergentism that looks almost magical? He doesn't go there. He doesn't explain it or develop it a lot in his book, but he says, okay, we need something else that underlies, that makes sense of how it is we get from here to here, or here to here. I mean, so he says, in there he's offering some kind of neutral monism or panpsychism, in which in later literature he commits and says, yeah, he's some kind of panpsychist of a sort, that at some underlying level there has to be these properties that make sense of these higher level organisms. And I think he commits to a kind of, what would you call it, a kind of non-reductivist sort of panpsychist view. Now, I'm not committed to that, so I'm not clear on that. But he does affirm some kind of underlying neutral monism that's not strictly physicalist, right, all the way down. So he does see the particles as having certain types of properties that are disposed toward consciousness, that ultimately he does bring in theism somewhere down the line in his theory. He says, yeah, somehow theism underwrites the explanation of these types of properties existing, actually, but also these types of properties at higher levels that emerge at some complex, in some sort of complex from some sort of complex arrangement.
Yeah, I think we briefly talked about it last time. If I recall correctly, do you make an argument that something like, why does this soul though emerge rather than say some other soul, or this mental state emerge rather than some other mental state?
Yeah, so there's this underlying intuition that I'm trying to motivate, and I think it's right about the nature of really even underlying phenomenal qualities, and that is getting at the heart of what is the subject that we're talking about, the subject or the self, right? So that's the real heart of it, and I think there's something really mysterious in some ways about the self or the subject, the subjectivity that we're getting at underlying consciousness or conscious states or conscious properties. And so I'm trying to press in on that subjectivity question. There's lots of growing literature out there on this question about subjectivity and how people account for it or make sense of it. But it does seem to me um, the basic idea against emergentism, panpsychism, all those views is that their underlying commitment to some kind of pseudo-naturalism or something where there are these bottom-up processes that give rise to these higher order organisms, that to me seems to be the heart of the problem. It doesn't seem to me that we would ever get the kind of subject or self or subjectivity that emerges up here from the lower bottom stuff and all that's going around, and no matter how complicated it is, it's not a complicated type of thing. So it seems that there's some other explanation that's needed to make sense of that. And so so I do run these arguments for after explaining these sorts of views and then raising some other general objections that are in the literature against them. I do sort of build on that literature and try to develop this intuition that there is something so unique about these substances, these subjects of consciousness, that requires a wholly different type of explanation to make sense of them. And this is where the origins discussion comes back into play for me, and where my creationist intuitions come into play. And it seems that emergentism, mere emergentism, just won't do it. Neither will a sort of reductive or non-reductive panpsychism do it. They're still both working from a similar framework, a bottom-up process that doesn't seem to account for this this fundamentality of the subject itself, a fundamental subject that isn't really made sense of by the body or the parts of the body. There's no garden variety object we can point to and say, that's it, that's me. And it doesn't even make, it's not even made sense of by the properties themselves, it doesn't seem. There's something more fundamental undergirding it that makes sense of the fact that you are you and I am me. And I think in many ways, intuitively, we even take this for granted, but upon, further reflection upon our own intuitions about ourselves and about the selves of others as being radically unique. There is something about the nature of subjectivity that seems to require a different type of explanation from the sort of bottom-up naturalistic processes that these alternative views are offering. And this is where I think the real problem comes in for something like an emergent self view. I mean, I think there are potentially other views relatedly, that have been raised against it, like how it is you get the kind of unity that's necessary. There's more complicated arguments in the unity of consciousness that suggest that, well, maybe you can't do it. There's also the kind of, how do you get a subject from an object? In those intuitions I share. Kenneth Einar Haima makes this argument against emergentism several years ago, and I think those intuitions are kind of in the background. That I share those intuitions. How do you get a subject from an object? But also, more to the point, the argument or objection that I develop is a kind of what's called a kind of a perfect or duplicate objection. So we can motivate the duplication problem, with different thought experiments that are commonly used in analytic literature, and that is like twin world hypotheses or twin world thought experiments. zombie experiments,
Mm-hmm.
fun, and then ghost twin experiments. Those types of thought experiments kind of are in the background, motivating that there is something about the physical that's distinct from the mental, and something even more fundamental about the subject or the mental that is subjective, that doesn't quite make sense of, or isn't quite made sense of by its properties, and if not by its properties, that it doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that can come about through this sort of generalizable process that these other alternative views are relying upon to make sense of the origins of the mental, and these regular lawful processes that give rise to these higher level organisms that are subjects themselves. It doesn't seem to be a sufficient explanation for what they are. And I think Hasker hasn't said this in print, but I think if pressed, he would have to. I think he would eventually, he'll come around to saying, well, he needs to bring theism in a bit more explicitly and robustly and thickly to make sense of how we get these subjects. But if you just have this sort of sui generis subject consciousness phenomenal, this sort of phenomenal unity that he's after, that and that is just what the subject is, and there is no underlying further informing property or feature or something or subject that makes it that subject rather than another subject that is intrinsic to it, rather than the properties that it has that are universalizable. Then you just have this sort of brute explanation, it seems, that's contentless. It just is that way, right? And maybe that's satisfying for some. There is no metaphysical individuator, right? That they're after, that they can give an essay of. There may be an epistemic individuator, which is something like what Lynn Redder Baker does in her first person. Let's see, her first person perspective, Naturalism in the First Person Perspective book, great book. But where she develops this kind of epistemic individuation, utilizing the first person perspective without a metaphysical individuator, which she just kind of leaves. It's just kind of brute. It just is the way that it is. Well, what I'm suggesting is, no, we have reasons to think, based upon our own intentional structures, conscious structures, we have reasons to think that we actually have access to the soul, or the designation that makes us who we are. And there is some sufficient way in which to make sense of the fact that I am me and not you. And I'm aware of that, or at least I have access to it. I can be aware of it through introspection and reflection. But then this gives rise to a further, more pronounced problem, which I try to flesh out and give more fine tip to, and that is perfect duplication. Right? How do we make sense of the possibility, at least the possibility of duplication, but also perfect duplication, where there are these twin people that are twin persons that have all the same properties, or the same body, all the same properties, maybe even the same, histories and the like, at least from an external vantage point. They have the same histories, same memories, and the like. How do we make sense of that? Is there any way to make sense of that? Is there any fact of the matter that would make distinct that person from the other person that is the perfect duplicate? And when you start looking at physical objects, it seems like, well, we rely upon the fact that there are duplications. There's lots of complex things out there. There's lots of organisms that are we can make we can like parse out differences between them and make sort of complicated differences about them. But there is something about the material that seems to brush against this sort of more underlying fundamental, this intuition about this fundamental subjectivity that the material doesn't seem to account for. It doesn't seem to even have. And this is why we can make sense of the fact that there are real duplicates, and we rely upon the fact that there are duplicates, even if there are if we take a relational view, which Max Black, I mean, his famous article, he talks about this, is an external relation occupying a certain space. Is that going to be a sufficient designation to make a distinction between an identical thing or a perfect duplicate thing that has all the same properties? And for when it comes to material things, it just does seem that there is no fact of the matter that makes distinct makes a distinction between identical and perfect duplicates. Obviously, they're not the same if they occupy different spaces. But when it comes to the subjectivity question of persons, that's insufficient for designating that person from another person. And at least on the sort of naturalistic stories that are told from when we're thinking about deterministic laws or probabilistic laws, there's at least the possibility that you could have a perfect duplicate, and that seems to be a problem. And it would seem to
reductio of sorts.
It would seem to undermine these other alternative theories out there. That wouldn't be a problem for creationism.
Right. No, that's good. Thank you. For those who are interested in buying the book, I'll make sure to have a link for it in the description. And anything else you want to say, Dr. Farris, before we let you go?
I haven't had Whataburger in over a month.
I haven't had it even longer than that. So, sadly, there's no Whataburger in Pennsylvania yet. But
no Whataburger there. Are they coming?
Not yet, but hopefully one day. Hopefully one day. Before the Amazon is in its fullness.
I wonder if you can buy microwavable Whataburger online.
Yeah.
Stocked up in one of your big freezers so you always have some.
I'd do that. I'd actually do that.
That you would. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Farris. Appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate it. Thank you.